9 words ruined a man's life. He never heard them spoken. Here they are. Does Job fear God for no reason? That is the entire accusation. Not a curse, not a sentence handed down, a question asked about a man who was not in the room, in an assembly the book flatly refuses to describe, by a figure whose name is not actually a name. And it was answered by the destruction of everything he owned and everyone he had, inside a single afternoon. He was never told. Not while it was happening. Not in the 30 chapters of argument that came after. Not out of the whirlwind. Not on the last page of his own book. You are about to be told what he never was. The man was called Job, and we cannot give you his year. Anyone who hands you one is guessing. What the evidence gives us is a man standing centuries before Christ, on the far side of almost everything most of us picture when we picture the Bible. Before Israel, before Moses, before the law, in a world where a father was still his own family's priest. And to understand how 9 words could do what they did, you need to know who he was. So the fall has a height. And you need to know who was speaking, because the picture almost everyone carries of him was assembled somewhere else entirely. Start with the man. The first sentence of Job is a verdict, and it lands before any of the events. Blameless, upright, God-fearing, turning away from evil. Then it is said again in the divine assembly, and this time it is not the narrator's opinion, but quoted as the Lord's own. And after the first round of catastrophe, a third time, 3 times in 2 chapters, and that heavy-handedness is the most important structural decision in the book. There is a door the book is nailing shut, and it is marked he must have done something. Everyone who has watched a decent person get destroyed has felt the pull toward it. Job destroys that explanation in the first 8 verses before the story starts. Whatever happens to this man, it is not punishment. You are told that first, and 40 chapters from now, 3 educated men will sit in front of him and tell him the opposite. So who was he? He is described as the greatest of all the people of the East, and the inventory that follows is not a vague gesture at wealth. Read it as an accountant would. 500 yoke of oxen, plowing capacity for a very large estate, 3,000 camels, and camels are not farm animals, camels are freight, which means caravan trade, 7,000 sheep, wool and meat at scale, plus, the text says, very many servants. That is not one fortune. It is 3 businesses held at once: agriculture, commerce, and herds. Remember that, because all 3 are going to be gone inside a single afternoon, and the servants with them. And later in the book, he describes his own former life. When he went out to the gate of the city, where the elders sat and disputes were judged, the young men stepped back, and the old men rose to their feet. The princes stopped talking. He was, in his own phrase, eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. That is the man, not a rich man who was also religious. A judge, somebody the city arranged itself around. And the first thing the book shows him doing is not judging anybody. It shows him getting up early, over and over, to offer burnt offerings for his grown children, in case, the text says, they have sinned in their hearts without knowing it. He does it himself, because there is nobody else to do it. No priest, no tabernacle, no altar but his own. That is one of the reasons we can place him where we placed him. He is not sacrificing for their crimes. He is sacrificing for their possible, invisible, unproven crimes. Anyone who has ever lain awake worrying about an adult child they can no longer protect knows exactly what that is. And the book adds one word that does a great deal of work. He did this continually. Now the camera moves, and it moves somewhere the Bible almost never takes us. There was a day the text says, "When the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser came among them." We have to slow down here, because almost everything most people believe about this scene comes from somewhere other than this verse. Start with that phrase, present themselves. The Hebrew verb means to take one's stand, to station oneself formally before a superior. It is the language of an official appearing where an official is required to appear. It is reporting for duty. It is not the vocabulary of a break-in. Second, the location. Look at what the verse says and at what it does not. It does not say heaven. It names no place at all. The popular picture, a locked gate, a shadow slipping past, is not in the text. It was added to it. Third, and this is the one that changes the whole video. In Hebrew, the word here carries the definite article. It is not a name. It is ha-Satan, the accuser, the adversary, the opponent. And Hebrew does not put the definite article in front of proper names, any more than English does. You do not say the David. What is standing in that assembly is being described by an office, the way you might say the prosecutor walked into the room. This is not a fringe reading. Open a modern English Bible and look at the footnote on that verse. It prints Satan in the line and tells you underneath that the Hebrew says the accuser. And if you want that proved rather than asserted, the rest of the Old Testament will prove it. Because this word is used all over the place, of ordinary people. When opposition rises against Solomon, the text names two of them, Hadad the Edomite and Rezon, and calls each of them a Satan. Men. Politics. And then there is the verse that ends the argument entirely. In Numbers, Balaam is riding a road he was warned not to ride, and the angel of the Lord comes and stands in the way. And the Hebrew says the angel stood there, l'satan, as an adversary to him. The angel of the Lord occupies the role. One verse, and the case is closed. In the Old Testament, this word is a function, a position in a court. So, an assembly convenes. A prosecutor takes his place in it, as prosecutors do, and the first words spoken are not his. He is asked where he has come from, and his answer is worth hearing precisely because it is the answer to the question this whole video is named after. He says he has come from roaming the earth, from walking up and down on it. He is not described as living there. He is described as arriving. He comes in from the field, from the territory he patrols, to the place where he is required to report, and he reports. That is the honest answer to the question this video is named after. Nobody got in. Somebody came to work. And if that sounds like a smaller answer than you were promised, stay with it, because the smaller answer is the one that makes everything after it worse. A break-in would mean the universe had a security problem, and security problems get fixed. This is not a security problem. This is procedure. And then the conversation turns, and here is the part that has kept readers awake for 3,000 years. The prosecutor does not raise Job's name. The question comes from the other direction. Have you considered my servant Job? The subject is introduced from the throne, not from the floor. We are not going to soften that. A lot of retellings quietly flip it, because the story is easier to tell if the accuser walks in already hunting. He does not. And then the 9 words, the ones you have been carrying since the first minute of this video. Does Job fear God for no reason? Now you can hear what is actually inside them. Notice what is not being attacked. The prosecutor does not dispute that Job is righteous. He grants every word of the commendation. What he attacks is the motive. The Hebrew word underneath for no reason means gratuitously, for nothing, without payment. And the charge is that nobody, anywhere, has ever loved God for God, that everyone is on a salary, that devotion is only what contentment looks like from the outside, and that if you took away the herds and the 10 children, what was left would not be worship. That charge is not really about Job. Job is the test case. The charge is about you. And here is the mechanism that makes the rest of the book possible. For the accusation to be tested, the payment has to be removed. All of it. Which is why what follows is not partial. The prosecutor asks for permission. He does not take it. He asks. And permission is granted with a boundary attached. Everything the man has, and not the man himself. In these 2 chapters, the accuser never once acts on his own authority. He appears when the assembly convenes. He answers when questioned. He requests. He is limited. There is no war between equals here. There is a court, a prosecutor in it, and a line drawn in front of him that he does not cross. Let me stop the story here, because I want to ask you something before we go over the edge. You have known the reason since the first minute of this video. You are, right now, one of the very few people in this story who knows why. He is not one of them. He never becomes one of them. So, have you ever been through something you never got an explanation for? Not something you eventually understood years later. Something where the explanation simply never arrived, and you had to keep living anyway. Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and on this video in particular, I would rather hear from you than talk at you. Because that gap between what the reader knows and what the sufferer is allowed to know is not a flaw in this book. It is the book's entire design, and by the end you are going to see why. Now, the afternoon, his sons and daughters are eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. That detail matters in a moment. A messenger arrives. The oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the raiders came out of the south, took the animals, and put the servants to the sword. And the man ends with a sentence, "I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, the text is explicit about this. Another one comes. "Fire," he says, "fell and burned up the sheep and the shepherds. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, a third. Raiders from the northeast, this time in 3 organized columns, took the camels and killed the servants. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, a fourth. Your children were at the eldest brother's house. A great wind came in off the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Count what the book is doing with sound. 3 times the same phrase. While he was still speaking, there is no interval. There is no space in which to absorb the first report before the second one lands. And 4 times, the same closing sentence from 4 different mouths, 4 sole survivors, 4 identical last lines, like a bell struck 4 times. And look at what it is doing with property. The oxen and donkeys, the farm is gone. The sheep, the herds are gone. The camels, the trade is gone. 3 businesses, in the order a man would have listed them, wiped in the time it takes 4 men to run to a door. Then the children. One more thing about that 4th report, because the text flags it rather than leaving you to notice. A wind struck the 4 corners of the house. Wind comes from a direction. This one is described as arriving from all of them at once. And the man gets up. He tears his robe, he shaves his head. He falls to the ground, and the word the text uses for what he does on the ground is worship. And he says the line that has been read at more funerals than almost any other sentence in Scripture, that he came naked out of his mother's womb and will go back the same way, that the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, and that the name of the Lord is to be blessed. And the narrator adds the third verdict. In all this, he did not sin, and he charged God with no wrong. The accusation has failed. On its own terms, in its own test, with everything stripped away, the thing that was left was worship. You would think that ends it. There was a day, the text says, again. The assembly convenes a second time. The prosecutor takes his place a second time, and the question comes from the throne again, and this time it contains something new. The commendation is repeated, and then a phrase is added, that the man still holds fast to his integrity, though he was destroyed without reason. That is the same Hebrew word. The identical word the prosecutor used in the first hearing. He said, Job serves God for nothing. The answer in the second hearing is that Job was ruined for nothing. The accusation comes back as the verdict on the accusation. If you notice nothing else about the literary craft of this book, notice that. And then the prosecutor escalates because his case has just collapsed and he knows it. Skin for skin, he says, and the sense of it is that a man will trade anything he owns to save his own body. Property was never the real test. Children were never the real test. Reach the flesh, and the worship stops. Permission is granted a second time, and a second boundary is drawn, and this one is narrower and more terrible than the first. Everything except his life. That cuts both ways. It is a protection. He cannot be killed. It is also the reason the suffering has to go on. He is not permitted to die out of it. And so the man who sat in the gate of the city ends up sitting somewhere else. The affliction is described as sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The text does not name a disease, and neither will we. People have proposed diagnoses for centuries, and the book is not interested in any of them. What the book gives instead is an object, and it is the single best image in the whole prologue. He takes a piece of broken pottery and scrapes himself with it. A man who employed very many servants, who owned 3,000 camels, is sitting with a shard of a smashed pot because it is what is available. Everything in his life that was worth anything is now the sharp edge of something that broke. And where is he sitting? Among the ashes, the ash heap, the refuse ground outside the settlement where waste was burned. 2 locations, and between them sits the entire social catastrophe. The gate and the ashes. He has moved from the place where the city made its decisions to the place where the city put what it had finished with. It is perhaps 200 meters. It is the whole distance between being a person and being a problem. His wife speaks once. She tells him to curse God and die. That line gets her a bad reputation she has not entirely earned. She buried the same 10 children he buried. She lost the same house. She is watching a man she loves scrape himself with a piece of a pot and refuse to say the one thing that might at least end it. And then she vanishes from the story completely. The book never mentions her again, and it never says what became of her. His answer to her is not a rebuke so much as a question. Shall we receive good from God and not receive trouble? And the narrator, for the last time, says it. In all this, he did not sin with his lips. And then the book does the strangest thing in it, and almost nobody notices. The accuser disappears, not defeated, not punished, not driven out, not confronted, not rebuked, not addressed. After the sores, he is never mentioned again, not once in 39 remaining chapters. He is absent from every speech. He is absent from the whirlwind. He is absent from the restoration. There is no scene where he is dealt with. He asks his questions, gets his permissions, does his work, and the book simply stops mentioning him forever. This is the natural place to ask the question you have probably been holding. Is this the same being later Christians call Satan by name? Honest people land in different places on that, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. What can be said is where the shift begins. There is exactly one place in the Old Testament where the word appears without the article, in Chronicles, in the story of David's census, and the parallel account of that same census, in Samuel, tells it differently. Two accounts, one event. That is the hinge where an office starts turning into a name. But in this book, he is still the office, which brings us back to the exit. Why does that matter? Because it tells you what the book actually thinks the enemy is. If the accuser were the point, he would get a confrontation, a defeat, a scene, something. He gets an exit so quiet you can read the book twice and miss it. What stays is the accusation. 9 words, still standing in the room after the man who spoke them has gone. Does Job fear God for no reason? Oh. And for the next 30 chapters, that charge is going to be prosecuted again, with total sincerity, by 3 men who have never heard it, who traveled a long way to help, and who love him. They come from 3 directions, and the first thing they do is the best thing anyone does in this book. They see him from a distance and do not recognize him. They weep. They tear their robes. They throw dust over their heads, and then they sit down on the ground with him. And they stay there 7 days and 7 nights, and not one of them says a word, because the text says they saw that his suffering was very great. 7 days of silence. It is the finest act of friendship in the Old Testament. And if the book ended at that verse, we would have nothing to complain about. Then they open their mouths, and it goes on for 30 chapters. And here is what they are actually saying, underneath the poetry. In every speech, in every variation, there is a reason, and it is you. God is just. Suffering is the wage of sin. Therefore, this is a wage. Therefore, there is a sin. Therefore, search yourself and find it. Do you hear it? They are arguing that a man's standing with God can be read off his circumstances, that devotion and reward are the same transaction seen from 2 sides. That is the prosecutor's case, word for word. They are running his argument in reverse, and they have no idea they are doing it. And it is unfalsifiable, which is what makes it cruel rather than merely wrong. Every protest of innocence becomes further evidence. Now he is not only a sinner, but a proud one. There is no answer he can give that the system will accept. Meanwhile, the reader, who was in the room in chapter 1, sits there knowing they are wrong and unable to say so. And Job, buried under this, starts reaching for something the book has no word for yet. He says there is no arbiter between them, nobody who could lay a hand on both parties at once. He says, and he says it in the middle of his misery, with no evidence at all, that his witness is in heaven. And then he says the sentence people have carved on gravestones for 1,000 years, that he knows his Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. That word, Redeemer, is a legal term. It is Goel, the kinsman redeemer, the relative with the standing to buy back what was lost, and to act for a family member who cannot act for himself. 3 times, in 3 different images, Job gropes for the same missing figure, an arbiter, a witness, a kinsman with legal standing. He is not asking for comfort, he is asking for a defense lawyer. And that is the true shape of his tragedy, and it is why the courtroom in chapter 1 matters so much. It is not that a prosecutor stood up in the assembly. It is that a prosecutor stood up and there was nobody at the other table. The charge was made in a room Job could not enter, in a case he was never told he was part of, and no one spoke for him. Whether he understood how far that reaching would eventually go is genuinely debated, and we will not pretend otherwise. But the reaching is unmistakable. and it is in the text. Then the storm comes. The answer, when it finally arrives, is delivered out of a whirlwind, and it is not an answer. It is a tour. Where were you when the foundations were laid, when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy? And there, in one line, that assembly appears again, framing the book at both ends. Then, the sea, the dawn, the storehouses of snow, the wild donkey, the ostrich, the hawk, the horse that laughs at fear. Chapter after chapter of the world, and not one syllable about the prologue. He is never told. Not about the assembly, not about the question, not about the wager, or the permission, or the boundary. The whirlwind speaks for 4 chapters, and never mentions any of it. And here is the thing that ought to stop you. It works anyway. What he says at the end is not, "Now I understand." What he says is that he had heard of God with his ears, and now his eye sees. The resolution of the book of Job is not information. It is presence. He wanted an explanation and got an encounter instead, and the book insists that this was the better thing, which is either the most infuriating sentence in Scripture or the most consoling one, and which of those it is probably depends on where you are sitting today. And then the verdict, and it is not the one anyone expects. The anger is not directed at the man who spent 30 chapters shouting at heaven, demanding a hearing, accusing God of injustice to his face. It is directed at the 3 who defended God the whole time. They have not spoken rightly, the text says, as his servant Job has. The book vindicates the complainer and rebukes the explainers. The men who kept God's reputation intact are the ones who need Job to pray for them. The restoration is real, and we are not going to oversell it. The herds come back doubled. 10 more children are born, and here the book does something it has not done once in 42 chapters. It names the daughters and leaves the sons anonymous. And it gives those daughters an inheritance alongside their brothers, which almost nothing else in the ancient world would have done. He lives 140 years and sees 4 generations. Old acquaintances come back and eat with him, and they arrive after the recovery begins, which the text mentions without comment, and so will we. But the text never says the loss was undone. 10 children died. 10 children were born. The book does not claim those are the same arithmetic, and neither should we, and anyone who has buried a child and been told about Job's happy ending has every right to the anger that produces. The narrator's own summary of the whole ordeal, near the end, calls it evil that came upon him. The book does not distribute the blame the way a modern reader would prefer, and it is not our job to repair it into something more comfortable. He got his life back. He never got his answer. So does the accusation ever get answered? Not in this book. And to see the answer, you have to leave it, which brings us finally into the world this channel actually lives in, because the book of Job did not stay in the ancient East. Among the scrolls recovered from the caves near the Dead Sea, alongside fragments of Job itself, was something rarer, an Aramaic translation of it. Targums are scarce among those scrolls. Job has one, which means that in the centuries around the 1st century, Jewish readers were not just preserving this book. They were translating it, working it, arguing with it. And when Paul writes to Corinth, he quotes Job directly. This was live text. And the courtroom that opened in chapter 1 was still open. Look at the prophet Zechariah, and you will find the scene again, unmistakably. A high priest standing in filthy garments, and the accuser standing at his right hand to accuse him, with the definite article, exactly as in Job. Except this time the accuser is rebuked, and the filthy clothes are taken away and replaced. Then go to the upper room, the night before the crucifixion, and listen to what is said to Peter. That Satan asked to have him, demanded him, to sift him like wheat. Stop there. That is the same structure. A request, a permission, a named man who doesn't know he is the subject of it. But something has changed, and it is one sentence, and it is the whole reason this story is worth 30 minutes of your evening. Peter is told before it happens, and he is told something else at the same time. I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. Job had no idea. Job had a prosecutor and an empty chair beside him, and he spent 42 chapters reaching into the dark for an arbiter, a witness, a kinsman who could stand for him, and never learned that any such person existed. Peter is handed both halves in a single breath. He is told there is a request, and he is told there is an intercession, spoken in advance. Follow that to the end of the New Testament, and the room fills in. Paul asks who will bring any charge, and it is a rhetorical question because the prosecution has no case left. John writes that if anyone sins, there is an advocate with the Father. That word is parakletos, one called alongside, counsel for the defense. The exact office Job could not name, named at last. And in the final vision, the accuser of the brothers is described as thrown down. The prosecutor who was never dealt with in the book of Job doesn't go unaddressed forever. He simply is not addressed there, in front of the man in the ashes. Which leaves one question, and it is the one I want to hear you argue about. Which would be harder, to suffer without ever knowing why, the way Job did, or to be told in advance, the way Peter was, that a request had been made about you, and that it had been permitted? I do not think that has an obvious answer. Tell me which one you would choose, and why in the comments. And if you want more of this, the text opened properly, the Hebrew checked, the ancient world rebuilt from sources instead of rumors. Subscribe, and the next reconstruction will find you. Then, when you are done arguing with me, there is one thing left to do with this book. Someday soon, you will be sitting with someone whose life has come apart, and you will feel the pull to explain it to them. Everyone feels it. 3 good men traveled a very long way to do exactly that. They meant every word of it kindly. They were wrong about all of it. The best thing anybody does in the book of Job is not a speech. It is 7 days on the ground, saying nothing.